My role is simply to welcome you, Gill. Gill Bates is the CEO of the Charities Aid Foundation in Southern Africa. And thank you very much for making the time to give us your insights, which will be drawn on the article that you submitted to the journal, which was published in the first issue of the International Review on Philanthropy and Social Investment. This is a series that we started simply because we wanted to delve deeper into some of the thinking and the thoughts that authors had when they were putting together the papers. And so we hope to continue with this series in our next issue as well. So welcome everyone. Like I said, we record these sessions so that we can broadcast them for a wider audience. And so I will hand over to Kira, who will facilitate the session and the conversation with Gill. Over to you, Kira.
Thank you, Peggy. Good afternoon, good morning, Dumelang to everyone, wherever you're joining us from today. I do see some of you in other parts of the continent, and it really excites us to see you here, so welcome. And those who are watching on the social media platforms, welcome to all of you. It's very exciting to welcome you to our 5th edition of the webinar series that began last year to place the spotlight on the inaugural issue of the journal and allow our authors an opportunity to tell you about their work, tell us what they found, the methodologies that they used, and explain what contribution their findings make to the sector. What process did they go through in developing these papers and field notes, and what was their experience? We're not able to detail all of that in the inaugural issue. So this is the opportunity and the time when we get to do that. We've already had 4 webinars that are similar to this one, and they've all managed to fulfill the agenda. So today we are continuing on this journey and turning our attention to one of the other speakers and authors who were part of the first issue. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker to you today. She does send her apologies from the other author who wrote this paper with her. Gill Bates is from the Charities Aid Foundation in Southern Africa. Gill is a CSI specialist, and her paper was titled Adapting to COVID-19 Experiences of a Philanthropy Infrastructure Organization, something which would be very interesting because we all had to adapt to COVID-19 in one way or another. This field note is available for you to view on the CAPSI website, capsi.co.za. If you go to the journal page, you'll be able to see Gill Bates' paper there, along with all the other papers that were published in the first issue. She has prepared well for this session. Some of you may have already read the paper. We're happy about that. If not, you can read it as well after the session. So we're going to allow the first half of the session to Gill to present her work to you. And we encourage you to listen, to participate, and not just witness. You are very much here to learn and also engage with us. So it is by no means a monologue. You are free at any time during the webinar to post your questions and comments on the chat function button below. And we actually do allow you to talk if you're feeling brave and comfortable enough to do so. And of course, if time allows, you can raise your hand and we will be sure to attend to you. When we do allow you to speak, I just ask that you keep it brief, say your question quite promptly, and then we'll definitely attend to you. This session is being live streamed on Facebook. It will also be available on the CAPSI YouTube channel. So if you don't follow us yet, you can catch all the other webinars that we've had for this journal on YouTube. So you can watch it again and again if you missed anything during the live proceedings today. We do ask you to please keep your microphones on mute throughout, unless of course you have been acknowledged to speak, at which time we ask you to keep it brief. So those are the logistics for the webinar. Let's get straight into it. I'd like to call upon our speaker today, Gill, who's also representing her co-author, and she's going to take us through her field notes. So Gill, Karibu Sana, you have our full attention.
Thank you so much, Kira, and a very good afternoon, colleagues, and special thanks to Professor Becky Moyo. Thank you, Kira, for the very warm welcome and also for the invitation. It's a huge pleasure and an honor for me to be with you this afternoon. And CAPSA was enormously privileged to be invited to contribute to content which was published in the first issue of the International Review of Philanthropy and Social Investment Journal. The rise of African philanthropy is receiving growing attention as it occupies its rightful place on the African and the global stage. Now more than ever before, philanthropy actors, as well as other stakeholders, are required to collaborate and share best practice and provide thought leadership and innovation to a landscape forever changed. Colleagues, I, together with the CAPSA Board of Directors, would like to congratulate all the academics and the authors who have contributed and will continue to contribute to this new body of knowledge. And it's also critical for developing compassionate and innovative sustainable interventions to a world plunged into crisis. So my congratulations, and it's a great honor to be here. Colleagues, in terms of the topic, before I get there, please allow me to give you a little bit of information about the work of Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa. CAPSA is a civil society and independent non-profit organization which promotes and facilitates effective giving, volunteering, and investment for social change. CAPSA aims to challenge existing social, economic, and political inequalities by increasing resource flows to civil society organizations who are working in poor and marginalized communities. CAPSA has been represented in South Africa since 1997, and in the year 2000 became registered as a non-profit organization with PBO status. Additionally, colleagues, CAPSA is a proud member of the CAF Global Alliance with offices in the UK, the US, Canada, India, Russia, Brazil, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Australia. So we have the benefit of having access to best practice strategy, policy, and research throughout the world. While CAPSA does not undertake individual fundraising activities, it does act as a philanthropy infrastructure organization and is an intermediary and works at the interface between the world of philanthropy and civil society. CAPSA is also cause neutral. We leave no good cause behind. And our primary reason for being, colleagues, is to champion philanthropic giving, both in Southern Africa and globally. CAPSA is a knowledge-driven organization, and consequently, we advise our corporate clients drawing on evidence-based research and CAF's World Giving Index report, which is published annually and which measures trends and patterns in respect of generosity behaviors across the globe. Colleagues, it's been really, really interesting and gratifying to note that recent research studies have indicated that Africa is bucking the trend and the global South is closing the gap on the global North, those countries typically with developed economies and deep pockets. It's really pleasing to see that Africa is rising in terms of generosity behaviors, our very profound difficulties notwithstanding. Colleagues, moving on to today's topic and the field notes which CAPSA contributed to this prestigious journal, allow me to contextualize the significant learnings for CAPSA, which for over 20 years has been a trusted intermediary and a one-stop shop, if you will, in respect of moving charitable funds via its various programs. As an intermediary, CAPSA has both corporate and non-profit clients, and we move funds via our various programs, such as our payroll giving program, otherwise known as Give As You Earn, a very, very powerful tool where employees contribute a part of their salary every month to a charitable cause. Typically, the corporate will match that grant, and both the match and the donation is paid over to CAPSA, and we will make sure that the funds arrive at the place where the employee wanted to donate the funds. So obviously we follow strict due diligence rules, etc. And payroll giving, colleagues, really represents unrestricted grants and funding to the nonprofit sector, which is now critically needed. Additionally, we manage corporate social investment funds, we manage employee volunteering programs. We are also helping families, high net worth individual families, to establish family trusts and foundations. Increasingly, our corporate clients are reaching out to us for assistance with leveraging their BE scorecard points, particularly in respect of the SED pillar. And also more recently, CAPSA has become involved in cross-border giving, which has become extremely critical in our country right now. So in that backdrop, colleagues, one of the most important value propositions for CAPSA is our strict adherence to governance and compliance imperatives via our NPO validations offering. So registered nonprofits are required to submit various pieces of documentation, including founding documents, the articles of association, audited financial statements, board details, registration with regulatory authorities, SARS compliance certificates, etc. Obviously, the charity sector is particularly at risk in terms of potential money laundering and also in terms of moving funds which may ultimately support terrorist activities. And therefore, CAPSA and CAF globally has very strong controls in place in order to manage regulatory compliance, risk and reputation in respect of moving philanthropic funds around the world. This level of diligence and care has been ingrained in the fabric and the practice of CAPSA for decades and has served us well until the advent of the novel coronavirus, which hit our shores during March 2020. The South African nonprofit sector, colleagues, as you will know, was vulnerable even prior to the onset of COVID-19. Likewise, the South African economy was ailing, and the arrival of the global pandemic further exposed the existing fault lines of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. After South Africa, went into a full and hard lockdown, one of the immediate consequences was an unraveling pandemic of hunger and starvation. CAPSA immediately established an emergency COVID-19 fund in order to support NPOs rendering direct services at community level. CAPSA was contracted by a South African donor entity to allocate a sizable donation amongst qualifying NPOs working in the food relief space. While CAPSA has a huge database of validated nonprofit organizations, the donor wanted CAPSA to extend the offering far beyond our database to include other Johannesburg-based NPOs, so as not to have any exclusion in the process. Eligibility criteria were finalized with the donor and the call was issued. The response was astonishing and the fund was oversubscribed in less than 5 days. Given the pandemic, social distancing and regulations restricting movement, obviously site visits for verification purposes were not possible under the circumstances, and this potentially placed CAPSA's compliance imperatives at risk. Other challenges included not being able to reach qualifying NGOs as offices were either closed or operating off-site. It was also difficult for NPOs to submit documentation to CAPSA without access to resources such as printers, copiers, scanners, etc. And additionally, many NPOs were just not in possession of the required permit to operate during the hard lockdown. All of these circumstances added a layer of complexity to CAPSA's tried and tested validations process, and it delayed the process of getting funding to where it was most needed quickly and safely. CAPSA was also required to manage the conflicting needs of both donor and recipient NPOs. So colleagues, today it's a great pleasure for me to reflect on the article that we contributed, the field notes, and just share with you a couple of lessons that we learned during this process, which I hope will be helpful for all of you. The first one was to note the delicate balance between agility and compliance. Clearly, during this period, CAPSA needed to become more agile. While we could not bypass accountability and compliance, we could, however, review existing processes and dispense with those non-essentials to the verification process. Ultimately, CAPSA's due diligence process, operational for decades, had to be adapted quickly to ensure that they met the essentials of compliance while remaining and becoming agile enough to respond quickly and to meet the objective of providing NPOs with critical funds necessary to assist the communities which they served. We also found reporting needed to be more streamlined and more flexible. And ultimately, the lesson was this, that a leaner approach to government still has gravitas and can be trusted. This has resulted in the introduction of minimum requirements for the fast tracking of funds and ultimately lowering the barriers to entry for NPOs while simultaneously ensuring compliance and protecting both the donor and the NPO recipient. Colleagues, the second lesson we had to learn at CAPSA relates to the issue of grant readiness amongst NPOs. And CAPSA continued to document our learnings during 2020, which was a watershed and an unprecedented year. As a result, we conducted a number of NPO surveys in order for us to take the temperature of nonprofits impacted by the global pandemic. An analysis of the findings indicated an increasingly vulnerable nonprofit sector, with many organizations not having sufficient resources to continue rendering services for longer than a period of 6 to 12 months. It was also evident that some organizations, while rendering critical services, simply did not have the resources, the time, or expertise in respect of doing compliance work, and consequently were not grant ready. CAPSA has realized that this is a critical gap which must be urgently addressed. Colleagues, just in terms of the feedback that we gained from our NPO sample during last year, some of the issues raised were the following. When we asked what was most needed from government, organizations tended to say that government policies needed to encourage giving, they needed unconditional cash grants, there was a great need for PPE for staff and volunteers. There's also resources such as food, medicine, and shelter. When we asked our organizations how they had adapted during the crisis, the responses largely were that organizations started working remotely, they found alternative ways to deliver services, they found new ways to reach their beneficiaries, they started emergency fundraising, and ultimately they learned to develop collaborative partnerships and relationships. When we looked at a closer look at their response about government support during the pandemic, there was strong agreement that government measures had not enabled NPOs to access new sources of funding. So consequently, ultimately then, one of the key learnings for CAPSA during 2020 was that even after lockdown regulations were slowly eased, and despite NPOs returning to work, nevertheless, many remained unable to comply with amended governance and compliance imperatives. And consequently, despite continuing to render critical services, remained in the very difficult position of not being eligible to receive funds and not being grant ready when funds do become available. Colleagues, this is a clear and a present risk for an already vulnerable sector and must be urgently addressed in order to strengthen capacity and build resilience in the sector, which is a core strategic imperative for CAPSA. Colleagues, in respect of the third learning, we also had a look at compliance and community-based organizations. CAPSA has taken note of the thousands of CBOs and faith-based organizations inter alia who are not formally registered, but who continue to render most essential services to those most vulnerable and marginalized families in our society. Such entities also typically are much closer and work at neighborhood level. And such organizations likewise lack the resources, the time, the skills, and the staff to do compliance work. This is also a challenge which infrastructure organizations like CAFSA must address, as the prevailing circumstance results in such organizations being excluded because of high barriers to entry in respect of being considered for funding. Innovative and sustainable solutions must be provided by all stakeholders in the philanthropy space. Colleagues, I'll just share briefly with you some other learnings from CAFSA as well as our partners in the CAF Global Alliance around the world. Firstly, our research has clearly indicated that civil society survival is at risk if support is not provided now. Secondly, a longer-term view must also be adopted to ensure that civil society survives and continues to play a critical role in post-COVID-19 rebuilding efforts. There is also clearly a need for unrestricted funding, as well as a need for a relaxing of stringent reporting requirements. Infrastructure needs to harness support from both individuals and communities, and government clearly needs to create a more enabling policy environment to facilitate the flow of funding into civil society. Additionally, there has been a call from our civil society nonprofits for government to recognize and support NPOs as a core pillar in our young democracy. Colleagues, also collaboration and partnerships are now more critical than ever before. We need African solutions for African challenges. Continued indigenous research is needed to support a strong and leading voice from the global South. We also need to grow mass giving and promote active citizenship. That is, we as individuals may give our money, goods, experience, and time. And interestingly, colleagues, in the 2020, CAFSA conducted research amongst a sample of middle-class South Africans to assess their giving patterns. And we found that this group gave R1 out of every 3 to either a charity, a non-profit, or to help a family member. I think this also speaks to our prevailing culture of Ubuntu. We also know that giving to social justice causes is now more critical than ever. And unfortunately, we are seeing a declining trend. But this can have a greater impact and influencing a broader audience. So it must be carefully looked at. While philanthropy alone cannot solve South Africa's complex socio-economic problems, civil society, government, and the corporate sector must collaborate to bring resources and our best thinking in order to arrive at innovative, scalable, and sustainable solutions. Obviously, we also must be mindful of the trust deficit in all the sectors in which we operate. And likewise, there is a rise in skills-based volunteering online, which is especially prevalent and gaining traction in the current circumstances. Colleagues, in conclusion, adversity through the ages has always brought challenges and opportunities. Now more than ever before, South Africa requires the collaborative efforts, flexibility, innovation, and best thinking of civil society, government, the corporate sector, and philanthropy to respond as actors in concert with agility, professionalism, and care. The powerful combination of agility and compliance in respect of the distribution of philanthropic funds can and must be leveraged to support those most vulnerable and marginalized in our community, as the complexities resulting from the global pandemic are navigated and our country is readied for a world forever changed. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Gill. Was that the concluding point?
That was.
Thank you. I really like what you say about adversity. It does bring out the best in people and organizations. And you've actually said quite a lot. So it must have been difficult for you to condense all of this into some field notes. But I do think it's worthwhile, as the people are thinking of their questions and comments to you, to just go back to your methodology, I think we need to just inform them that this data was collected, was it July, August sometime, because the paper was published in September. So you would have done the work sometime July, June, July, thereabout. So I think it's good to just go back to that and then also describe your sample a bit more. You've spoken about community-based organizations that you found were quite excluded, even though they're doing the bulk of the work, civil society organizations that you've engaged with. So just unpack a little bit, take us back to June, July, when you collected the data, the type of people that you brought together, how many, etc. Because all of that is not in the paper, but it will help to provide some context.
Thank you for the question, and it's a very important one. And I think we were on a huge learning curve. So in fact, this data was started to be collected from the 1st of April, when the funds first started flowing, immediately after the lockdown. So the call was put out to a variety of databases. Aside from CAFSA's database, we used the NGO Pulse and other, databases that are in operation in South Africa. We reached out to the Department of Social Development, and so we wanted to make it as broad as possible. Because obviously, CAFSA's database was finite, and the donor wanted to reach the most, the marginalized organizations. So that in itself was the first challenge for us, because the donor was very specific that they wanted to focus on the smaller organizations and those organizations that perhaps didn't have the developed infrastructures and resources that larger organizations did. So the donors' criteria was quite specific. The annual turnover had to be under 5 million. The staff complement had to be less than 20. There was both a rural and an urban focus. So the donor was very particular in terms of the profile of the nonprofit that they wanted to reach. And typically, CAFSA had not worked with this kind of organization, given our stringent governance and compliance imperatives. And obviously, time, was of the essence. So many organizations put in applications, and we had to undergo a filtering process. And bearing in mind, we were also working off-site. So our finance department wasn't there, our IT department was somewhere else. So we really had to filter all of these organizations to check that they complied with the basic criteria. Were they registered? Did they have a permit to operate? Were they rendering emergency food aid in Johannesburg? Were they registered accordingly? And that was a really, really tough process. And the donor, wanted the funds to go out quickly. And we were just running into enormous challenges in terms of getting those funds out. So we wrote an extensive report, obviously back to the donor, detailing chapter and verse how we complied with the brief, with the funding criteria, how we presented the call on social media, the number of people who responded, the number of organizations. They were close to 1,000. We were only able to fund 20 of them. So it was a constant filtering process, and it was an incredible learning curve for CAFSA. In terms of the other research that I quoted in terms of the World Giving Index, the methodology there is really not academic, and I need to say that up front, given that I am speaking in a very academic context. CAFSA's approach is really to seek the opinions of a sample of donors right across the world. So the methodology really is a survey and a questionnaire to a sample of people across the world, and the questions relating to generosity behaviors relate to, for example, when did you last help a stranger? When did you last give money to a charitable organization? And when did you last volunteer your time? So those were the questions that were posed. And obviously these responses are collated by a team of academics in London, and there is another check that comes through South Africa. And it's just quite fascinating to look at the trends, you know, both locally and internationally. For example, one of the fast facts was recently where the country in Africa where you were most likely to be helped by a stranger would be Liberia, for example. And in one of the earlier studies, one of the most generous country was Myanmar. So those were really, really interesting trends. And obviously we as a global entity sit together because we're wanting to measure the trends. One of the other responses and trends that we identified pre-COVID was the enormous growth of the middle class, including the middle class from Africa. And our actuaries and our academics at the time predicted that by the year 2030, some 2.6 billion people were set to join the middle class. Now that for us was very profound because that potentially meant that, you know, additional funding could be released into civil society. Obviously COVID has changed a lot. Many of the middle classes have now been pushed into a poverty class. So, you know, our new research will need to obviously look at a COVID-19 landscape, but that's the type of research that we do at CAF, at the Global Alliance, and in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Gill. It does help to provide some context. I just want to inform everyone that we're going to move on to the second half, which is to take your questions and comments to Gill. You do have the option to put it on the chat function. All of you have access to that. And if you're feeling brave and comfortable, you can raise your hand and briefly share your question with Gill. So please go ahead and do that. And whilst people are thinking of their questions, Gill, out of interest, this was last year. We've all been in COVID for a year now. It's been over 12 months that we've been dealing with this. Do you find that the resilience and agility that you speak about in the paper and you keep describing here has grown? Are civil society getting better as a result of the lessons of COVID?
Kira, I think it's an important question, and I do agree. You know, the first year was really, really tough, and you know, preliminary indications are that this year is not going to be any easier. So that's, you know, that's the first comment. In respect of our non-profit organizations that we work closely with at CAFSA, we have seen a resilience and an agility, and you know, the most remarkable innovation that's being applied to keep organizations going. You know, obviously non-profit organizations are now having to do more with less. You know, their funding is decreasing. They are unable to have their traditional fundraising events, you know, like golf days or whatever it was. The restrictions on travel have affected the nonprofit organizations. Many have had to, you know, retrench staff. And obviously they operate in an environment with diminishing resources, but an increasing demand for services. So obviously that must be absolute breaking point. And I think at CAFSA, we just, you know, bow our heads in absolute respect to those organizations that are at the coalface every single day, just getting up and getting out of there and showing up and rolling up their sleeves to help. So, you know, I think the sector, as I said in my presentation, is vulnerable. But, you know, historically, the civil society sector in South Africa has has been resilient and has been a very powerful force for change, you know, particularly during the apartheid years. Civil society in South Africa played a pivotal role in respect of bringing about democracy and heightening issues of civil and human rights. So the South African civil society sector just always seems to be able to survive, but it is at risk, it is at peril, and that's obviously a huge concern for us because we regard a vibrant and a civil society as a critical pillar for our young democracy and to keep our government accountable. So I think it remains stretched and vulnerable, but it's continuing to fight the good fight from our perspective.
Great. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right?
Yes,
so if another pandemic comes, we'll be much more prepared for it. All right,
Indeed.
so please do share your questions and comments to Gill. Just a last one from me, Gill, was about the community-based organizations. At the time when you did the study, you found out that they're very much excluded from compliance. Some of them are not registered. So I'd like to know what can be done to change this, because you rightfully say in your paper that they're the ones on the ground executing the work. So if we are to build resilience, because it's not only civil society organizations that need resilience, the communities as well need resilience. How can we change that picture? It's a reality throughout the continent.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And we've been looking very closely at this critical sector. Now, what we're doing at CAPSA is we are devising interventions where we can build that capacity within those organizations. So that's where our role as an intermediary comes in. We have corporate clients who have critical skills like in math, science, technology, engineering, that we can link to nonprofits through employee volunteering, for example. But the CAPSA has developed an NPO builder offering, and that is where we bring in experts who are in the field, who volunteer their time to help these organizations, you know, get their basic governance and compliance documentation in place. The other thing that we are doing as CAF, we have recently negotiated an agreement with our international counterparts for CAPSA to receive funding from foreign countries. And obviously the issue of cross-border giving is quite technical, it's quite complicated. We need to be in compliance with the Reserve Bank and SARS, etc. But that just is another way of getting funds into this country, particularly via the diaspora. Last week we were called by an ex-South African living in the US who actually wanted his funds to go to a very, very rural organization in PE. Which we hadn't dealt with at all. So we got in touch with the organization, we got them ready and fully compliant. And I'm happy to say that that was the first donation that flowed last week. So we really need to be getting to the grassroots and to be really helping them to be ready to receive funds. The other phenomenon that is prevailing in the country is known as the asset-based community development approach. I'm a retired social worker, so back in my day it was known as neighborhood or community work. And that really is to look at what communities can offer. What are the inherent skills and resources in a community? Like, for example, somebody may have cooking skills or baking skills, or they might be retired teachers. There might be a community hall that can be utilized. So it's really a more positive focus on what is the inherent assets in a community that are there. There are exceptional skills and talents in our communities that we can mobilize and together make a difference. So that movement is gaining traction. So, and I think also obviously communities have to be involved. You know, there cannot be anything about communities without communities. So those are some of the initiatives that are happening. I hope that answers your question, Kira.
Yes, it does. I actually like that PE story. So if we do more of that, and it's a good thing he asked you to go to a remote area that you've never dealt with before, because otherwise, how else can they gain experience and register themselves if they're not thrown into the deep end?
Quite right. Quite right.
So thank you for that, Gill, not only for your discussion here, the paper, and providing some more context in terms of how you guys managed to put this together. We very much acknowledge that it was an organizational effort and that you had received funding as well to be able to bring it through, which highlights the importance of us publishing this work that we do, because 10 years later, we're going to be reflecting and say, remember 2020, when we had the pandemic, what was going on in the civil society sector? And your paper will give us that snapshot of where we were in 2020.
Thank you so much.
All right. Any questions, comments for Gill before we close the session? We have one on the chat from Beggy. He wants to know if there were any new tools or vehicles of giving that you noticed during the pandemic beyond monetary contributions. So anything else that you saw besides money contributions?
Yeah, it's a lovely question, Kira. And in fact, we did see a lot of innovation and creativity. Obviously, foodstuffs were number one on the list. We were called, to get food parcels out on a large scale. And what we did was we partnered with Gift of the Givers for that piece of work. So that was a great partnership that managed to get a lot of foodstuffs out. And then also a number of our corporates made available hand sanitizers. So again, we drew on our partnerships with other people on the ground. Obviously, these were huge barrels of hand sanitizers, which needed warehousing, transportation. So we partnered with a number of people who had, the trucks and the permits to operate, and those hand sanitizers were delivered to a variety of recipients, and also clothes, medicines, etc. So we were really thrilled to see the response of South Africa. They opened their hearts, their wallets, and also, of course, they donated time. Many of our corporate leaders, we partner them with school principals or learners who just are really needing mentorship and guidance, and that's easily done online. So it's really the perfect storm to partner an executive or an academic with a child needing assistance with maths or literacy, etc. So we've been seeing a lot of innovation. Obviously, online giving now is gaining traction, online volunteering. So it's been really humbling and thrilling to see that Africa remains an inherently generous continent.
Thank you. We are a generous continent naturally. So the next question is from my good friend, Matilda. She says, thank you for the presentation and the insights. What were the funds used for? So what was the money used for? Matilda, I'm assuming you mean the funding that they received.
Yes, so Matilda, thank you for the question. And yes, the donor was very specific, and this was a donor-driven fund. The donor wanted the monies to go to organizations rendering emergency food aid in the Johannesburg area. So it was a very, very specific brief. Because they felt that was the immediate crisis. We agreed that back then starvation most certainly was an issue. So that's where the funds went.
Thank you for that, Gill. So I don't see any further questions on the chat, but remember, if you haven't read the field notes, you are able to do so on the capsi.co.za website, where you can actually see all the other papers that went through in the first issue. So this highlights the importance of this journal for us to be able to tell the African stories, to report facts and data in terms of what's been going on in our continent, not only for COVID, but other philanthropic activities that are ongoing. So this first issue was quite exciting for us. There will be more to come. We encourage you all to read the papers and also look out for more, and also submit, if Xolani will allow you, also submit your papers, and we see more publications from our continent about our continent. So we really appreciate your time today, Gill. We appreciate your insights. This recording will be available on YouTube. It's also available on Facebook. And we are going to have the last webinar for this series next week. So we really look forward to your participation there. Join us again on Thursday, same time, but with different speakers. So we're going to conclude it here today, Gill. Thank you very much for that lovely presentation and your paper. We hope to receive more from you.
Thank you so much, Kira, for the opportunity, and to you, Becky, and we are delighted that our contribution was useful, and we'll look forward to further collaboration with you in the future. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Peggy, do you want to say any closing words before we end?
No, I think it's fine. I think you can close. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gill. I think
My pleasure.
All right. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. We'll see you again next week.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye-bye.
Bye.